perhaps by reflecting a little bit about my own journey with intersectionality. When the first interest I developed in looking at how different forms of inequality and identity live together was in 1974, which seems really ages ago, when I went to the BSA Sexual Divisions in Society conference, which was the first BSA conference on gender. And it was absolutely brilliant. And there was one paper there by someone called Middleton. I don't remember much about it, but it started off by saying how important it is to look at how gender, race and class would link. Now everybody has forgotten this reference, so have I. But it was in part, it kind of in passing, the person said, it wasn't, in the actual paper. And so, that prompted my interest. Already I had a lot of interest in issues of gender, and issues of ethnicity, and issues of class, because, my PhD actually looked, at those things already, but not in developing an approach which links them together. And I was lucky because at the University of Greenwich, where I got my first job, there was another colleague there called Nira Yuval-Davis, who some of you will know also, who was interested in very similar issues to myself. And we belonged to the sex and class group of the Conference of Socialist Economists, which is a group that publishes Capital and Class, or used to publish Capital and Class. And in the sex and class group, we had a meeting with other members of the group, which included Anne Phillips, Michelle Barrett, Cynthia Coburn, and various other people. And Nira and I wanted to form a little subsection which looked at the links between sex and race. We called it sex rather than gender in those days. And we asked how many people were interested in, coming with us on the journey to explore the links between sex and race. And I have to say that there was very little interest at the time. And this was 1981, 1982. The feminists there, and there was no black feminists in the group. And Nira and I were probably the only people who didn't have a sort of English background. And Cynthia Coburn expressed an interest, but then she got involved in other things. So Nira and I sat down and said, what are we going to do about it? There's very little interest. And we had been reading some of the work that was coming already from the States, Bell Hooks' work, for example. So we wrote an article which got published in Feminist Review called Contextualizing Feminism, Ethnic, Gender and Class Divisions, in which we tried to provide an argument, and this was published in 1983, which is a kind of intersectional argument, but of course we didn't call it intersectionality in those days. We called it social divisions, thinking about social divisions or linking together social divisions. Although we did use the term intersection, but we didn't say this is an intersectionality approach. And of course, a little bit later, there were other people who were interested in the connections between different social divisions. Some of them actually talked about intersections. There was a book that was edited by Gil Bottomley and Michelle de la Provence from Australia, who became good friends, which was entitled Intersections, S-E-X-I-O-N-S, Intersections, which was a play on the word intersections. People, of course, attribute the term intersectionality now to Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a black legal theorist, black feminist legal theorist, critical race theorist as well, who wrote in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And when people talk about it, they say Kimberly Crenshaw developed this. But of course, Pat Hill Collins was also developing an approach which was intersectional. But again, she didn't use the term intersectionality, although she used the term intersections. And when in the 90s, I read that, Kimberly Crenshaw had developed the theory of intersectionality. I've never come across this person. I had never actually read Kimberly Crenshaw's work at all. So, whatever we term the approach, it has a long history. And I've argued in some of my work that an interest in the intersections of different social processes is part of social theory itself. If we look at the work of Marx, Durkheim, Weber, they're all interested in how different facets of social relations interact together. No social theory can function, or sociological approach, without paying attention to the links between social processes. What's new, what was, I suppose, new about what we now call intersectionality is that it focused very much on social divisions, not just social processes in general, but the way in different forms of identity, different types of inequality come together to produce specific effects. But it's also very politically based. That's what's new about it, because it emerged really out of struggle, out of the struggle particularly, I would say, of black feminists, who saw that they were bracketed either as women or as black people, but never as black women. And the specificities of their oppression weren't being attended to. So we find, its origins are very anti-racist and very feminist. And that's what gives its particular strength, I think, that it's not confined to the academy. So we have to be careful when we're using what we call intersectional approach, that we actually attend to the political project of an intersectionality framework. It's not just a theoretical project, it's a political project that wants to make voices heard, that wants to make a change. So this is, for me, it's power. And, why I'm interested in it. It's not just for theoretical reasons, but because of the political aspects of it. But, of course, producing a political frame within which, attention is given to these forms of oppression is very difficult. We can perhaps discuss, some of the problems with translating intersectionality into policy and political approaches, perhaps in the discussion. So in this paper, which basically comes from a number of articles I've been writing lately, but the latest is a paper in ethnicity, it's called Intersectional What, which focuses on, what is the object of reference to intersectionality? What is intersecting? So this is concerned with showing some of the problems of translating intersectionality in a particular sort of way, that tries to provide a way of thinking about it which avoids some of the problems that one can identify with it. So instead of talking about an intersectional theory, which some people like, some people argue it is a theory, or instead of talking about intersectionality as a buzzword, which again other people like Kathy Davis have said that's what it is, I prefer to talk about an intersectional heuristic. I think that intersectionality provides us with a mode of thinking about things rather than any actual answers. It provides us with a sensitivity, an analytical sensitivity. So that I don't think it's a theory. It doesn't have its own concepts. It doesn't have the concepts together working to produce a kind of, a theoretical frame as such, but it gives us insights and points our attention to various parts of social life. And it asks us always to engage with how forms of inequality and associated forms of identity produce each other, reproduce each other, transform each other, connect together. Now, however, when we talk about intersectionality, there's two questions the what is it? What is the object of reference? What is it that's intersecting? What are the things, you know, that connect together, that reproduce each other and produce each other and so on? What's the object of analysis? And the second question is, how do they intersect? Do they collapse into each other? Do they constitute each other? Should we merely talk about intersectional categories, or are there categories beyond the intersectional that we still need to attend to? So the what question and the how question, you know, are important to address, and we don't need to answer them always in the same way. We don't need to necessarily agree, it seems to me, what the object of reference is. You know, the object of reference might be concrete social relations, concrete experiences of women as they intersect with their concrete experiences, black subjects, racialized subjects, and class subjects. It could be the concrete experiences, or it could be how discourses of gender, race, class, disability, and so on, whatever categories we might want to include here, how the discourses function, depend on each other, or how they contradict each other, producing certain effects in different spaces. But we don't need to agree. In fact, our research can focus on any of these. The important thing is to be able to say what it is, because otherwise, you know, you just use it as a mantra. Unless you can specify what it is that you're concerned with, and social life is rich and complex and multi-layered, then, you know, it is just a kind of rhetoric. And we have to avoid rhetoric. The danger is that in much of sociology today, there's a kind of passing phrase in many articles and books saying, of course, you know, it's important to know the intersectionality of, and that's it, which is, you know, really very just a rhetorical, just a, you know, if you like, you know, just a way of doing the right thing, saying the right thing, a fashion. So the first thing I wanted to say is how important it is in our research to be clear about what our terms of reference are, what we're interested in exploring in terms of intersection, and how we conceptualize those things that we see as intersecting. So there are different analytical levels. I talked about the discursive level and the concrete level. There's also an even more abstract level, which is the level of categories themselves, the ontological realm of the categories. When we think about gender, for example, what is that which is gender? What is that sphere of social relations that we can bracket up and say, these are gender relations? And can we continue using the idea, say, of gender as a set of specific relations? In the postmodern world and in the postmodern frame, gender, race and class kind of disappear because they're not regarded as having a specificity. But one of the things that goes in my own work with Mira and later I've argued is that even though there's no necessary ontology to gender, it's not an essentialist construction based, say, on the body or anything. I don't believe that it's an essentialist, it's a discursive framing. Nonetheless, there is a realm of social relations that is denoted with gender. There's a set of social relations to do with sexual difference, to do with reproduction, and to do with the organisation of sexuality, which the term gender tends to, will kind of note, which will point to, will ale, And that's a social ontology. It's not an ontology in an essentialist way, but it's the way human societies probably, and not everywhere is in the same way, should kind of categorize things. And categorization is part of human life. But the mode of the categorization, of course, is socially constructive. So that's at the most abstract level of using intersectionality. One would ask, for example, what are the connections between social ontologies of gender, social ontologies of race difference, social ontologies of class, social ontologies of sexuality, of ability, disability, and so on. And often these social ontologies involve the construction of binaries or oppositions between what we might thought as the right hand, as the power hand, and the left hand, male, female, black, white, ability, disability, heterosexual, homosexual. So those binaries seem to be particularly important at the more abstract level of social ontologies. And, perhaps one could argue that social divisions, if one wants to use this term, themselves are formulated through these binaries of, the self and other, the powerful and non-powerful, the right and the left. And those categories that don't contain such binaries maybe aren't so socially salient. The binary nature, or the oppositional nature, is what provides the hierarchical power of these divisions and makes them particularly important for investigation in an intersectional way. So, for example, something like age, which some people, or generation, which some people have argued is a very important part of an intersectional framing, and I wouldn't deny it. Nonetheless, one might say that age difference isn't quite as binary as gender, race, and sexuality, disability, and so on. So you might want to think of age as a category, as a sort of perhaps different sort of category. Possibly, but that's something that, is not written in stone and one can think about more than anything. So the first level of abstraction, as I've said, is at that level of social ontology. So you can read this, it's kind of a slightly different way to what I've spoken to you about. They're kind of like, I would argue, they're like kind of maps, these categories at this abstract level. They point to, or they hail, the kind of a cartography of difference, if you like. And they don't, such cartographies are not filled by anything in particular. They're just places, if you like. They're abstract places that can be filled in different ways. So, for example, the gender category, as a map, if you like, about difference, can be filled in all sorts of ways with different forms of cultural attributions or biological attributions. There's no necessary way in which they can be filled, and that's why they appear in such different forms historically and in different societies. Ideas about capacities of women, say, versus men, or ideas about, the kind of attributions that women have psychologically versus men. These will differ in different societies. But the place themselves, the idea of the binary difference, and the idea of the power of the one over the other, maybe is a little bit more universal in different ways. So I think this abstract level is important because it's at the philosophical level. It's the level of how do we conceptualize the social world, and categories form an essential part of the social world, and those categories point to those things, but they're politically, the categories themselves and the social constructions themselves are always social constructions. They're not given. They're ways different human societies come to conceptualize different. and use that difference for political and economic ends. They're not neutral. They're not just things that are there because that's what it is, but they're there because they serve interests, depending on your theoretical framework, you know, the interests of political classes, or the interests of economic classes, or the interests of patriarchy, depending on where you're coming from. But what's important is that they always serve some kind of social interest of, I think, the powerful rather than the non-powerful. The second level of abstraction, where we're thinking a bit of intersectionality, is what are called those of discourse, discursive practice. They actually involve specific ideas about what it means, say, to be a woman, or to be a man, to be black, to be white, to be gay, or heterosexual. There are discourses around these social ontologies. The abstract levels of social ontology are places, binary kind of places, and then there are discourses that actually specify. And they are, of course, these discourses are never monolithic, as discourses are not, and there are different discourses to be found, and counter-discourses, and there are transgressive discourses as well. Claims and counterclaims within discourses about, you know, what the criteria are for placing people into these ontologies, into these categories. You know, what do you have to do to be categorized as a woman? What do you have to look like? What do you have to be able to perform? What do you have to be able to display to be categorized in that way? So that these discourses will give notions about appropriate behaviours of, say, women or black people, which specify how they are placed, and indeed will also affect how they see themselves and how they identify. So, for example, the expectations about how little girls should behave. Referring to Amy Tosha, I have a small granddaughter, and I was so shocked that even today, when you go to buy a present for a child, there are sections for girls and sections for boys. And, you know, the section for girls is sort of pink and Aladdin and Cinderella and Barbie, and the boys are guns and tractors and so on. You know, and we see, of course, this manifested in our small children. They pick it up very early. So that these will affect how we become constituted, and how we identify as well. So the discourses are not just ideas or words, but they actually translate themselves into our material bodies. So the idea of the discursive as non-material, as something beyond the material, is too, again, sort of binary, because, you know, those discourses actually appear in our very bodies, in our very selves as well. Which means, of course, that we have to rethink what we mean by materiality as well. If the discursive or the culture could be material, then what do we mean by the material? Is it still valid to talk about the distinction between the discursive and the material? So this is the level of the discursive, which actually fills, if you like, the discursive fills those places of the ontologies. It fills them with specific things. You know, if the social ontologies are like empty vessels, if you like, are places in the world, then the discourses fill them with notions of what kind of people should fill those places, and what are the attributes of those people. And then also essentially, they're always essentially hierarchical. It's not just about difference, because I think difference itself also always involves a hierarchical placement. It's never neutral, seems to me. Now, staying at this level of the categories and the discursive element of the categories, intersectionality talks about the mutual constitution. You might have read this in many, many texts. Intersectionality is about the mutual constitution of categories. And mutual constitution is, can be interpreted to mean different things. What does it mean, a mutual constitution of categories? Well, it could mean that the categories themselves, in their own right, do not have any function, do not have any role, but rather we should always look at how they come together. They're mutually constituted. Or it could mean that they're always shaped in relation to one another. And I prefer the second version, which they're always shaped in relation to one another, because it seems to me that the discursive element of the categories constructs them in a separate way. That although there might be some similarities, for example, between the way gender attributions work discursively and racial attributions work through inferiorizing discourses, through ideas about pollution and so on, that we find in the cases of discourses about women and discourses about, say, black people. Nonetheless, the discursive elements are themselves different. The categorical formations are different. And that there are similarities and differences between the discursive elements of gender and race, just to take two examples. So that I prefer the idea of mutual constitution of categories to mean that they're shaped in relation to one another rather than they can be got rid of completely. I mean, some intersectional theorists might say, well, you know, the categories in their own right, we can't really explore categories in their own right. We have to always look at them in their intersecting forms. But I would say there is still a purchase in looking at discourses around gender, discourses around race, discourses about sexuality. That I don't think you always need to be intersectional in the sense of, you know, always thinking about how they connect. Because there are specificities historically and contemporaneously to discourses around this and to practices, of course. I think they're irreducible. They cannot be explained. The categories are irreducible. They can't be explained by saying, looking at the way they add up together. And this additive model of intersections, you add the oppression of being a woman to the oppression of being a racialized subject to the oppression of being working class. Then we get more and more and more oppression as we add this additive model. You know, we criticised it already, you know, in 1983. You know, the idea of triple oppression, that you just add one onto the other. So it's not an addition, nor is it a multiplication or anything like that. But rather there are specific ways in which they're shaped in relation to one another in specific places and specific times. So you need a spatial and locational, a spatial locational dimension, as well as a temporal or chronographic, if you like, dimension to understanding how intersections work. They can't be added to one another, and then you can't always assume that they always connect together in the same way. Sometimes, for example, in social relations, ethnicity or nationality counts much more in the experience of a person than being a woman, or being black, or being gay, or whatever. So that, you know, for certain experiences that migrants have, you know, maybe the lack of nationality, the lack of citizenship is the most powerful determinant of their experience. And we found this, for example, in many studies that we've done on migrant women, that for many migrant women, you know, being a woman for them is, their experience of oppression is more tied to the migration process, the migration trajectory, than anything else. So that being a woman affects other aspects of their lives. At least the way they articulate and narrate their experiences. If you want me to stop at any point and interject, I'm quite happy for this to happen. So, the other thing about intersectional categories is that I think we can think of them as shaped in relation to one another. Another way of putting it is to say that they're dialogically constituted, rather than being reduced to one another or being got rid of as separate categories. We can say there's a dialogical relationship with the categories. They're different and distinctive as categories, but the level of social practice, they interpenetrate each other and produce specific effects through the way they converse, if you like, with one another, and they transform social relations in that relationship. And they also produce contradictions. The idea of additive models of intersectionality was always that, you know, you add gender oppression to race oppression and so on and so forth, and you end up with more and more oppression. And then you get into the problem of talking about what Hancock says, sort of the oppression Olympics, you know, who's the most oppressed of everybody, you know. But if you abandon that way of thinking, then you can say that not only are some divisions more important than others in particular circumstances. I mentioned nationality, for example, in some cases, or gender in others, perhaps. But that they produce contradictions. You can, through the way that they converse with one another, or dialogically formulated, you can produce situations where somebody might be in a position of great oppression and subordination in one social setting, but in another social setting be much higher up the scale. A good example are with some migrants who might be very racialized and oppressed, you know, in the country of migration, but sometimes, you know, if they go back to their homelands and they have managed to perhaps save a little bit of money, you know, bought some land, and display greater wealth in comparison to some of the poorer villagers or townspeople that they've left behind, their social status might be higher in their country of origin. So there they would be, they would have, overall in terms of stratification at least, they would have a contradictory position. In one setting, they would be very low down the scale of social stratification, but in another environment or another country even, they might be higher up the scale. And this is why I think social stratification theory, particularly in the transnational world, cannot maintain the idea that people are always placed in class terms in the same place. Their class position itself will vary depending on where we're looking and where they are. That isn't to say that that it's relativist and we can't talk about poor people anymore or disadvantaged people anymore, but rather that we need an analytical sensitivity to the way in which different locations and places will construct subjects differently in terms of scales of hierarchy and stratification and social value as well, social value of difference. So this brings me more directly to the third level of abstraction, which is the concrete. And my argument is that at the level of concrete social relations, at the level of concrete practices in people's everyday lives, in their everyday experiences, in the everyday organisational structures they face and political structures they're embedded in the economic relations that they're related to, that they occupy. And in these places, at the concrete level of the real world, this is where intersectionality functions best. Because at this level, the mutuality and dialogical relationship of being a woman, being black, and so on and so forth, has the most power to determine one's social life, the way they come together, these things. So whereas at those other different levels of abstraction, at the highest level of the social ontology, and at the discursive level, we can find specificities to gender, specificities to racialization, and so on and so forth. At this level of abstraction, at the concrete level, it's much more difficult to disentangle where the modes of oppression emanate from, what the links are with people's experiences and places in the concrete world, position in the concrete world, to the gendered, racialized, and so on, and classed, whatever. So it's important to try and do it. It's important to get there, but how do we get there? Do we rely on what people tell us? How they understand the world? Do we measure, the number of sort of violence they've had, sexual violence, racial violence, hatred, forms of hatred, hate talk? We can get there. We can find to try and unpack it, but it's a much more difficult exercise. And I think this is where we can say that intersectionality, the importance of an eye which pays attention to how these things relate to one another, is the most important. And it's much more difficult, for example, with, say, hate crime, to be able to say this is a hate crime, which is racial. It's only racial hatred. A hate crime against a woman will have aspects which, are about sex, patriarchy, as well as about race. And also there would be class aspects are there all the time, as people like Beverly Skeggs have pointed out. The class nature of a lot of this, is fundamental. I'm going to move on, so you can have a copy of this talk on this overhead. So as I said, intersectionality functions best at the level of concrete relations, or positionality and hierarchization, and leading to complex forms of hierarchy and contradictory, as I've said before, forms of hierarchy. So I'm maintaining that, it's never just one way. There are always contradictions in the processes. Just as Eric Olin Wright, a long time ago, in the days when students used to study Marx and Marxists, he used to teach his work, he talked about contradictory class locations. What I'm saying here is that there are contradictory intersectional locations too, that they're never, always the same in different places at different times. So the notion of contradiction is very central to what I've been developing, and as well as complexity. And what I've also, in terms of the methodological aspect, which I know you're interested in, I think it's quite useful to think of different societal arenas or societal domains which we might want to see how these intersectional categories function and intersectional relations function, so that they're embodied within different societal arenas. Now, the idea of different societal domains or different societal domains is one that various social theories have discussed, but I'm using it in a rather different way. Sylvia Morby, for example, talks about different domains of gender, race, and race. I'm not using it in that way. I'm not saying there are different sets of relations as such that form social life, that social life can be bracketed into this, but rather the idea of societal arenas is a heuristic tool. It doesn't mean that we really think that the sphere of, say, experience is different and can be studied differently to experience of organisational structures. but it just means that it's quite useful to be able in our research to say, I'm going to be looking at the experiences of human subjects, or I'm going to look at the way organisation structures function. I'm going to be looking at forms of representation. I'm going to be looking at intersubjective relations, how relations between people work. It doesn't mean that these things can be abstractly studied on their own, because when you listen to people's experiences, you also, as relational theorists have argued, will get a grip on the structures that they face. People will talk to you about them, and through their experiences, they will tell you about migration controls. They will tell you about poverty in the labour market and unemployment. They will tell you that, you know, their boss, was prejudiced against them, and, you know, that they found it difficult to get employment because of their foreign-sounding name, or because when they appeared at the interview, the employer saw they had a black skin, or they were Muslims or something. These things will tell you about structures, but what you're doing is you're focusing on their experience, and through their experiences, they're telling the story of the structures. On the other hand, you could put to one side experiences and think, you're going, how is this organisation structured? How are things structured in the workplace, for example, to take an example? You know, what are the roles? You know, and who fills those roles? Which is a different kind of exercise, equally important intersectionally, but it depends on what you're interested in. So that each of the arenas, and I'm going to do what in my mind is the arenas, but I've kind of hinted on them. Oh, there they are, they're very small. But, you know, one kind of model, and it's not necessarily the only model, you can form your own, about delineating societal arenas as objects of investigation for heuristic purposes for your research, would be the organisation structural, which includes family structures, networks, educational systems, legal system, how population categories organised, then the representational discursive, and let me read some of it, if I don't need to read it out. The intersubjective interaction, and experiential and narrational. So this is one way of thinking about how to actually go about doing an intersectional research. Because if you don't have, a kind of, again, sort of map of what you're interested in and what you're trying to do, you can just get bogged down and think, oh God, intersectionality, how am I going to do it? How am I going to think about, what is it that's intersecting, and, where and how, Whereas if you are clearer about your interests and what you want to focus on, in this sort of way, it helps you much more to think about what it is that you can focus on, delimit, your frame. So mutual constitution, in a way, I've already covered it in my talk, is mutual constitution is a problematic term because it can be interpreted in different ways. And one example, again, is the practices of securitization of Muslims in Europe is much more about issues of ethnicity and race than class and gender, at least at the specific level, so that you can't abandon a class-based lens, or a gender-based lens, or a racialized-based lens. You still need these. Talking about intersectionality doesn't mean we throw those things out the window and say it's all intersectional, because that doesn't mean anything. So, and sometimes we find that race is the most salient category, or gender is the most salient category. They produce dialogical contradictory positions. I've already mentioned that. Now, translocations. Some of my work has been developing the notion of translocational positionality, which is a bit of a mouthful, I have to admit. You know, it's just that I needed to find a new term. Partly it arose out of a rejection of the notion of identity, because I've written before about the problems of an identity framing. Too much focus on identity. Identity is a problematic notion. What does it mean? It can mean all sorts of things. It privileges human subjects as having coherent notions of themselves and having static positions. You know, there are all sorts of problems that have been identified with identity, not just by myself, but by others, most notably by Bruno and Cooper, in slightly different ways to the way I did. Anyway, it arose out of that, and I was trying to find a different term for understanding how people think of themselves, how they position themselves. So rather than being about identity, which is, you know, where are people placed in identity structures and how they see themselves in identity structures, I focus on how are people located, how do they position themselves in relation to their social locations. And social locations are a kind of alternative way of thinking to identity and to categories or social divisions. Locations are kind of, it uses a spatial metaphor. A location involves a set of processes and relations at particular times in particular spaces. That's what is important. It's a kind of here and now, if you like, approach in terms of concrete relations. So that translocations means that people's locations are never uniform. Their very locations are always in transit. And their positionalities, therefore, how they conceive themselves and their relations to the world, where they see themselves placed in the hierarchical scale, will depend very much on where they are at a particular point in time. And those locations are never fixed. They're always translocations because they shift. The moment passes and a new moment emerges. The translocations also shift because they may move from one neighbourhood to another, one town to another, one country to another. So that it's the interspace between the different spaces that people occupy. So that it's a way of capturing, if you like, a moment of fluidity, which includes both structural fluidity and more positional, personal evaluation fluidity. So it's that interface between objective structures and how we understand those objective structures, that they all, you know, the boundary of difference is a moving one, and one which produces, therefore, change and contradiction and transformation rather than being fixed. But this isn't a lecture about translocational positionality as such. And I, you know, always grateful to those often PhD students who've taken up, and others, of course, who've taken up this term and interpreted it in their own way. And as long as they found it useful as a way of thinking through their own problematic, then, you know, I don't think we need necessarily to always share the exact, if you can find an exact resonance to it. The important thing is that it works as a way of thinking through and critiquing some earlier problems with some of the conceptions found in the literature. But maybe that's something we can do in the discussion if you're interested. So, paying attention to operations of power, emphasizing processes rather than fixing people or groups of people. So, my conclusion, moving from categories to locations, unpacking discourses and narratives, focusing on the concrete as the moment of the intersection, as primarily the intersectional being the concrete, spatial, the importance of spatiality, the importance of temporality, the importance of power, but also the importance of maintaining a focus on the specificities of gender, race and class, as well as how they connect to one another. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Floya. Yeah, wherever you'd like to sit, wherever you feel comfortable. What we'd like to do now is first opening up maybe of some questions and thoughts that have arose from Floya's excellent and very inspiring presentation. And then we would like to hear from you, and how are you using, or have you used, or thinking of using the idea of intersectionality, may I use that, or the lenses of intersectionality in your own work. So opening the space for sharing, so that for sharing with Floya and with us your own work. So maybe first some kind of questions and thoughts that arose from Floya's presentation, and then following on with your own research and presenting a little bit your own thoughts on this, I was nearly calling it framework, but on these lenses. Okay? And I promise there's coffee on the way as well.
My question is around hierarchy.
Sorry?
Hierarchy.
Yeah.
Because you talk a lot about that. And in real life experiences and the lived experiences of people, that's what they will experience, that there's a hierarchical stratification. There's not much talk about it, there's not much, literature around it, And my fear is that this whole idea of intersectionality will probably go the pathway that frameworks or ideas or perspectives like critical race theory and racial formation theory, I read them and I'm excited, I'm like, oh wow, this really speaks to the oppression and what I feel and what I think. However, it hasn't gained, it's something people reference. We reference it in our literature review, but we've not been able to take it out of the box. We've not been able to apply it. And the challenge I've had, with my work, and I know we will have a section for that, so I'll try and reserve it for, talking about how.
Do you want to move slightly closer, because that would be great if you could come in a little bit. So I can hear.
You want to kind of form a circle, so we're actually forming a little bit, when you're not sitting there isolated. Can you hold that thought?
Oh, no, I don't want to. Yes, sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
So I think the main challenge is that a lot of the work is very theoretical. It's been kept in that box. How do we move from that space, from theory? How do we test some parts of it? How do we talk about this hierarchical stratification? What is it? How do the different class, gender, different abilities, how do these things interact and how are we stratified? So again, for me, that is the practical angle, and that's what's going to give us the strength, There's no empirical studies, no scientific studies. So again, we seem like we're just yap. So for me, it's how do we cross from the theory is brilliant, I believe it, I read it, it's true. In the lived experiences, it's there. How can we take segments of that? So in my research, I'm looking at, if we say, for example, in Ireland here now, and we say it's race, or it's race, whatever name we want to call it, the question I'm asking is, I work with a project where we've dealt with migrants from over 60 different nationalities in the past 8-9 years, and we support them to find employment. Now, the challenge I have is, if it is race that affects everyone. Then why is Polish, Spanish, and Nigerian clients, why is their experience in the labor market different? So if there's a difference in their outcome in the labor market, then that means that race must be interacting in a way, there must be other things that is interacting with race. So what are those things we want to try and name them? How do they interact? And that's when I think we can really begin to talk about policy that is not just on a talk level, but at a level where we actually get change. So that's the dilemma I have with myself. How do I can't find I have the framework of theoretic framework. I don't have empirical studies to model it after. So unless I borrow some of all the beautiful things you've talked about, like translocation and positionality, again, you said we should move away from categories. So I really kind of like that. So we're moving from categories to looking at how we're positioned in society. So being a black woman, so that positions me differently from being a black man. So rather than this category which we've been dealing with that I don't resulted in much, so we're looking at how that positions me. And so again, I'm saying, how do we change that position? Because that's my challenge with belonging. Because if we look at belonging, then it's categories, and I'm saying, I want to belong. I'm like, no, I'm happy with this color. I just don't want to be positioned where I have been. So the challenge is the positioning, not even the categories themselves. It's just that it's the categories that we have as a way of explaining the positioning, if that makes sense. So yeah, so how can we, not theorize it because we've theorized that, but how can we research it? What can we borrow from what you have to develop a method, to conduct scientific research?
Thank you very much. I think you found a really good kind of way to already bring the research in. Maybe give us your name.
Ebona, Professor.
Ebona, okay.
School of Social Justice.
Fantastic, Ebona. Will we just, would you like to respond to each, or will we just do a little round so that everyone can follow Ebona's brilliant example here to connect her thoughts on Floya's talk already to the research? I think that was just a really perfect kind of flow into what we had planned already, Ebona. Thank you very much for that. No, sorry. Good. Yeah, very good. Will we collect a little bit and then the final response of Floya? How do you feel?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, perfect. So who wants to, I think everyone has to talk now about their research. Who wants to come next and how Floya's literature, and also in particular what she has outlined here, is reflected in your research, is giving you new ideas or raising problems. So anything you would like to connect, or however way you'd like to connect. And give us your name and your affiliation maybe as well, so that we know where you're from.
I'm Maureen, I'm from the School of Politics and International Relations, and my overall project is trying to develop a feminist investigation of new types of European Union governance. But what I find most useful from what you were talking about is, first of all, at several points you kind of reminded me about the importance of naming what you're looking at, which is something I'm terrible at, so I get too distracted. But I think I loved your delineation of the different levels at which you can have your focus. And right now what I'm trying to do is connect to something you mentioned last night in the talk about how the state remains a point of reference, even though we're also clearly transnational now. And what I'm finding is that at the EU level, which isn't a state and is moving beyond the state in many ways, the state itself is kind of a hidden reference point. And I'm trying to unpack what baggage it has brought with it. So not just ideas of citizenship and nationality, but even where the state shapes things like gender, race, sexuality, and trying to see what is brought to that level. And I think what you've talked about there in terms of kind of picking where your focus is, mine would be very much at the structural level and at kind of the organisational level of EU policy, and it's quite helpful to be able to narrow in that way, so that's really useful.
Great, thanks very much, Brent.
Yes. Well, I can go.
Perfect.
Okay, my name is Berna, and I'm from the School of Languages and Literature, and I'm doing a PhD in Spanish. So, but my interest in all this is because I'm looking at how the Jewish community in Argentina so this is ethnicity, is represented in Argentine film. So when I was reading your papers yesterday, and we were talking about transnationality, yeah, and I think I'm looking at the wrong, but I don't know, but I just focus on the national aspect of it, yeah. And to tell you the truth, I have never heard of it, of intersectionality, because I'm not involved very much in sociology. So it's all new to me. But when you were talking, and you were talking about the second level of abstraction, yeah, so I thought, oh, that's what I'm doing, actually. Because I also work with the discourse, and the discourse I work with is the discourse of Argentineness. Yeah? There's such discourse, and I work where are Jews placed in this discourse, yeah? And it has evolved over time. Yeah. And the discourse, it exists, yeah? I mean, it has been written down, actually, by sociologists in Argentina, but it can also be seen through film. Yeah? And that is what I'm looking at when we talk about the societal arena. I think that's what I'm, my societal arena, would that be, my question is, would that be film? That's the form of representation. Yeah. So I think I'm doing some things you are doing there, but I have never named them, as she says it. I have never given them the right name, probably. I'm just saying, okay, I'm doing this and that. But yeah, I can find myself and my research in many things that you have mentioned. Yeah. And then I wanted to ask you about identity, because that's the word I use, and you're talking about identity as a problematic term. Yeah. And it's a very to use the term of translocational. Yeah. So if you could maybe specify, because I read your article also, and if you could specify a bit more, yeah, the difference between the identity and translocation. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. You want to go next, and whenever you'd like to come in, Floya, and
maybe I should come in after 3, because otherwise.
Yes, otherwise it gets lost, and it gets lost in the narrative.
Maybe
so
just
we have
very briefly, because otherwise.
It's just that my question relates with.
Okay.
Perfect. 3, you take 4.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yes.
It relates.
It's just okay. Then
so my name is Elsa. I'm visiting School of Social Justice. My study is about PhD studies about welfare and women and education. So it does not relate to migrations. So bear with me. I kind of have some question that I think is kind of problematic, but about identity. From your talk last night and what I hear here, should we deny the notion of national identity when we talk about translocation? Because it seems to me like in this moment I'm a foreigner. So as identity, I feel a Portuguese woman. When I'm in Portugal, I have a lot of Brazilian friends. They like so much to maintain their identity as Brazilian, wear the flag and whatever. So how does this relate with translocation? Because, yeah, I'd like to understand this a little bit better. And yesterday, also, when you talk about solidarity and you talk about giving up our own privilege, when we're talking about migrants, my question here is, I thought it was, and although I agree, but in general terms, to the general society, why should we? I mean, it is a moral question. I think it's more a moral question. How can I explain, for instance, to my friends that study economics or engineers? I'm thinking about a talk with different people from different areas, because maybe if I tell them this, they would say, yeah, but why should we? Not everybody shares this idea about solidarity. These were some thoughts that.
Okay. I'll start with. So your first name. Yes. The importance of race critical theory and racialization. I absolutely agree. I was listening to the news this morning, and there was a survey done on people's saying whether they were racist or not, and you know, more and more people are now saying, yes, I am racist. It's become more acceptable for them to say, and this is side by side with the growth of national front parties and youth parties, and it's, you know, race rears its ugly head explicitly. Not that it ever went away. People now finding it more comfortable to be racist, which is very, very worrying. So race hasn't disappeared from our lives. But of course, as you rightly note, you know, it's not just race. You know, being a black woman gives its own specificities as being a working class black woman. So that's one side of it. And how do we actually research that? And I think there is more and more research, to be fair, empirical research, which actually looks at the experiences of people who occupy particular positions of disadvantage or advantage. And that's important, and you can do it you know, in different ways, by talking to people, listening to their stories, or by looking at their wage and income levels, you know, looking at you know, their participation, their citizenship rights, you know, whether they have citizenship or not. There are many different ways in which you can chart, you know, people's positions in social life, and that's important to do. I think you can do it, and there are many examples in the literature of ways. I mean, something, you know, I mentioned Beverly Skeggs. Beverly Skeggs did a wonderful, gave a wonderful account in her book Formations of Class and Gender, which was written some time ago, on, you know, the way in which single working class white, mainly white women articulated their position in social life. And there she came up with this idea of disidentification, that in fact these women were disidentifying with a class position, that they thought that was they were being labelled. So they spent much of the time in their narrations to her disclaiming how they would be perceived by others. You know, you know, promiscuous single white women, you know, who don't look after their children properly. You know, and they spent their time trying to say we're respectable, you know, we're not promiscuous, we look after our children. They were disclaiming identities. So the notion of identification here is one of disidentifying, which actually, I think, although she doesn't explicitly say, shows that the way we think of ourselves often is framed through a rejection of attributions rather than a clear notion of who we are. We can say much more clearly who we're not than who we are, which is, I think, quite important in terms of answering the notion of identity as well. So I don't know whether that helps, but I say you can do it, focus in, and you know, the analytical heuristic of intersectionality is that it says race is important, but so perhaps at different times are issues of gender for racialized subjects, and class, and sexuality, and so on. And you can chart this in different ways. The importance of the state, absolutely. You know, the state is the vehicle by which things are designated and controlled, and therefore, you know, it's always paramount. People's experience of the state can be one of kind of being hoodwinked by what's going on, thinking they're powerful when actually they're being much more controlled than they think. And you know, have we reached a state of individualism where the state has kind of disappeared into nothing? Or how important is the state today, particularly in a transnational world where there are trans states like the European Union? What is the importance of, you know, the British state within the European context? How powerful is it still? And I think the national context, you know, still is powerful. You know, it hasn't disappeared, but it's framed within a set of policies which extend beyond it. But people's experience often is at that national, not only at the national level, but at the very local, behavioural level as well, or the familial level. So that, you know, there are different kind of arenas here in terms of the national, the transnational, the national, the local, the intersubjective as well, which function to produce people's lives. And then the discourses and representations, yes, I mean, clearly, you know, you're looking at a particular realm or a particular arena, which is very important. Film is a place where social representations can manifest themselves as well as be transformed, depending on who is making the film.
True, yeah.
As well. And you can find in those articulations about gender, ethnicity, class, and so on in particular ways, which gives us insights into the society within which the film is produced or what it's directed towards. The notion of but I think the thing about, you know, as a sociologist, what would be important for me is to look at the connections between these forms of representation and the standpoint of the people that are making the film, as well as social context more widely. You know, who's funded the film? You know, well, who's the audience? You know, what are the structures in place in the society which make those representations particularly, you know, salient or undermine those representations? So that, you know, all these different arenas that I spoke to have to be looked at also in the context of each other to do, I think, a much more thorough and complex kind of analysis. But identity, you wanted, and several have mentioned the notion of identity. Now, my, you know, sort of take on identity is that it presupposes a holistic self, someone who knows who they are. Because, you know, the question is, who are you? You know, if somebody asks me that question, I find it very difficult to answer, in the sense I say, what do you mean, who am I? You know, it's, and research subjects often say, when you say, what is your identity to someone, if you ever dared ask that question, you know, they say, oh, what do you mean I have to find something now to say? You know, what's the most important thing for me? Because actually people are complex and their identities are not given. And identity presupposes that people know who they are and that they use a well-known discourse about identity. The common thing is, oh, I'm Brazilian, or I am British, or, you know, whatever, or I'm a woman. You know, a well-known narrative. You know, they draw narratives around them. But does it really express the complexities of who they are? You know, you can learn much more about social representations and discourses from the stories people tell you about who they are, I think, than about, you know, sort of other things. Do they really, you know, feel that? And do we care about what they feel? Is that important? Do people feel things in different ways at different times? Well, that's a bit of a joke, of course we can. But, so identity is a problematic notion because it assumes the knowledge of a subject, a holistic subject, and it assumes a fixity of identity. It assumes this is the identity. Whereas if you move away from that, you can think of people being different things at different times. Of one element of their, you know, positioning being more important sometimes than others. And you can wear different clothes. That could be, I mean, I come from Cyprus originally. You know, when I'm in Cyprus, maybe I'm a bit more separate than when I'm here talking to you. When you, I mean, and you know, I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't seek for somebody to say to me, yes, this is what I am. I know who I am. Because, of course, some people might know things as being Brazilian. That's the important thing to me. But it's interesting when they say, this is important to me. Often it is when they're not in Brazil, perhaps, where it becomes then a sort of affirmation of something that they fear that they're going to lose, because it's a loss of a sense of a loss of self. It's a loss of place as well, and it's a loss of privilege, and they want to hold on to that as a counter to being colonised and undermined. So it doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that they will hold on to that always, and that when they're Brazil, that's how they're going to feel. So I think the notion of positionality, you is much, for me, more nuanced, because what it references is that I have this notion about where I am placed in the world at this particular point in time. This is my positionality, which partly derives from my objective position, but it's also the way I've come to understand through my biography how I react to my position, so that it involves both an objective and a subjective dimension together. So, and positionality is a shifting, dependent location. That's why it's translocational positionality. Your positionality itself, will shift depending on your transit process, and so on. So I don't know whether you can come back to me on that one. On identity. I mean, is there anybody here who feels that identity is still a very important and valid concept? It's not that the processes aren't important. I'm not saying, people's ideas about who they are and what they are is socially meaningful, but is it an analytically useful concept? That's the point. Mm-hmm. As sociologists, or whatever we are, as scientists, social scientists,
for instance, as a tourist in Ireland.
Sorry?
For instance, as a tourist in Ireland, the first days I was here, I heard nothing but seeing all the highlights in the city about Irish, the importance of being Irish, as in the difference of British. So this important that you are talking about colonization. So here it's I felt it very strong. So how should we call this? I'm just wondering. I mean, I'm not an expert in this subject, so maybe I'm asking very stupid questions. Yeah. Yeah, for instance, that.
Okay. I mean, I agree with you that it's not that people don't hold on to these labels and reinforce them in the state. Often, the Irish state. It's important that the project, the political project of the state, which is like a nationalist project, is that as social theorists who try to understand the world, we can't reduce back to identity. We can say, what lies behind this reaffirmation and reaffirmation of Irishness? It's not just a concern with identity, it's a concern with forging a particular political project. And it translates itself into people's lives, into their minds as well. And when they, when a taxi driver might say to being Irish is very important to me, I have to think, what does that actually mean? When it's important to me. What is it he's saying? You can't take it for granted, it's just about identity. It's just about how people feel about who they are. It's about taking a position, countering a position. It's a political act making a statement about identity. It's not just about identity. And that's the problem with the notion of identity, because it seems to be, it's just about identity. It's just about people's perceptions of themselves.
Mm-hmm. So it is positionality.
Yes.
Take some more. I think. Yeah.
Can I just respond briefly, because as you were asking about the question of foregoing privilege, and what would that look like, from a national identity point of view, and it strikes me that you can look at, for example, in the Irish situation, with the more recent migration that happened, there are lots of examples of the need to forego privilege in the process of migration that's happened in Ireland. For example, Filipino women that came into the care system in Ireland at various different levels. We somehow assume that there is surplus care in the Philippines, that we get access in Ireland or wherever we are. But there is a very large question out there as to whether countries that import care labour like that should compensate the countries that produce those care workers, so should contribute economically, materially, substantially to those countries, rather than assume it's surplus care which they can afford to do without. So sometimes the foregoing privilege needs to address specific structural inequalities, I suppose, that I think the system. So, you know, I think we can make arguments for foregoing privilege in lots of different arenas, I suppose, and we can make them material.
That's a good, yeah, it's a very, very good point. But you think, why should we? We don't have to.
Yeah.
Why,
Yeah.
you know, it's a, you say it's a moral issue. I mean, of course, you know, there are people who think, well, fuck them, you know. You know, who cares? But I don't take you seriously. I'm making that point, or is that your friend is saying?
No, this concerns me because I'm studying people on welfare, women on a minimum income scheme, and public opinion in Portugal is very against that. And what they earn average is €150 a month. And still public opinion is very against that. They should work. You know, they are lazy. Why should we work for them? It's not even that much money. So yes, the question of solidarity is very, you know, problematic in this sense.
Wow, yes,
Put something to that, you know. I wrote a novel, you know, and I addressed, it was a kind of a satire, and I addressed that issue. Again, if we reframe what those women do, for example, I can only afford to have 2 kids because I'm like career motivated, you know. But if everybody has no child or only one, in the next 50 years, the world will be empty. So we will have sociologists with nobody to teach. We will have doctors with nobody to treat. You know, we will have governments with nobody to rule. So again, if we look at the fact that yes, some people have chosen to work, it's a different kind of work. They use their tummies to produce babies and take care of the next generation. So again, it's the fact that we do not value women. We don't value our contribution. We don't value what we're doing. Somebody goes to school, uses their brains to become doctors. We pay them much. And a woman gives up her body for 9 months, gives up her taste buds for 3 years. You know, again, we have to reframe it. It's a reframing. The discourse out there is that they are sponges. And that's why I like critical race theory. It helps you to reframe, it's a counter story. And I say that if we as women or feminists begin to reframe it, but just that many of us who are feminists were very hardworking, so again we take the dominant discourse, which the male strain have put out there, and we jump on that bandwagon, and we treat the same women the same way. And that's why feminists don't agree. You know, so again we have the poor feminists, you know.
And that is exactly, you're just kind of highlighting the problem also around identity. How do we label or how do we name you know, those problems we encountering? Is identity a valid term or is it not? Research I do on conflict, you know, on consociational peace agreements, for example, are highlighting ethnic identity, and are we solving problems and conflicts with that, or are we actually making it worse by overemphasizing a difference? And as academics prescribing this, are we actually bringing creating an entity which is not real in the first place, to take what Floya was saying and what Roger Brubaker is also suggesting, and this momentary and the location, to look at what different positionings mean to people might be an interesting way forward. I would like to invite, maybe if that's okay, other voices, new voices into our round and sharing with us their learning. And there's a candidate already. If you give us your name and your thoughts and your project, please, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Marta Zorba. I'm from the School of Philosophy and working here as a teaching and research fellow.
Good spread here of all the different schools.
Yeah.
And did you write to me?
Yeah, well, my colleague wrote to you. Yeah. I mean, she's not able to be here today, so, well, I'm very happy to be here because my motivation for intersectionality studies came both from the political struggles and how do we kind of
make intersectional claims also in the in the streets and all that. I'm from Barcelona, from Catalonia, so the context there, as you would know, it's kind of well, there are many kind of intersecting struggles that need to be addressed, and sometimes these theoretical issues are just materialized in those situations. That's one thing, and the other one, as a philosopher, I'm also kind of interested in these more conceptual and theoretical tools, and intersectionality in this sense, it's really interesting, but I've been working in trying to unpack or catch out this notion of mutual constitution. And so that's why I thought that your paper in ethnicities was really up to the point in which, okay, what is that is intersecting and how? So how are these categories related? And the literature is full of claims in all disciplines saying, okay, mutual constitution is that categories change the nature of each other when they intersect or when they relate to each other. Or you said shape the nature, or are shaped by each other. And then, so if we have this on one side, and in the other side you have these different levels, there's more structural and social categories or social ontologies and the discourses under concrete. I was like thinking, okay, where does this mutual constitution fit in this framework? Because it's very assumed, an assumed notion, but very. So it's either additive or mutual constitution, and everybody goes for mutual constitution without explaining what it is. And as you said, I agree that it's quite. Well, we have to be careful with that notion, and sometimes it's not mutually constitutive. And then well, sorry if that's too long, but I'll be brief. I think one privileged locus of investigation maybe is experience, but in a sense of experiences in places. So I wonder why you talk about positionalities without maybe talking about experiences, not identities or anything, but just these experiences, and then see how different identities are placed within individual experiences and constitute not each other, but the whole of experience. So I'm not just experiencing, an oppressive situation because I'm a woman or because of other situations, but as a whole, the result of my experience might be oppressive more or less, or more privileged in one sense. But I'm trying to develop this idea of the categories not constituting each other, but constituting the whole of experience, and then that being a kind of privileged locus for investigation and in relation to the other levels.
Okay, can I reply to that? I mean, I think one of the problems with the concept of experience is that it's actually quite difficult to get to the experience as a researcher. How do you actually get to people's experience? And that's why I put together the experiential and narrational, because I think that it's through the narrations of people that's the only way in which we can capture their experience. But we know that the narrations themselves are construction, and that people will tell you all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons, and you can't take the narration as a privileged point of knowledge necessarily. We have to attend to it, and that's why the narration, the experiential has to put in my framework has to be put in the context of all those other ones as well. But we can focus on it, but we need to also attend to the structural representation on other levels in order to make proper sense of the narrational. So that if you privilege experience as being the ultimate point at which hierarchy or positionality is constructed, then you will be tapping into all sorts of things which people tell you, which may not necessarily be as such. So, of course, the point is, well, how do you get to knowledge anyway? Sorry.
So, but I guess that there might be tricks in interviews or somehow to. I mean, if you ask not about identities or something like this, but about feelings of comfort or discomfort in certain situations, or feelings of oppression, and then. So there's the thing of whether all experiences are just reducible to narratives. I mean, if we assume that, okay, I agree with that, but maybe there's a way of going behind or, you know, with or through these narratives, through experiences. Even if people say something in the interview, it might be that, you know, they're really feeling bad in that situation, but they have assumed that they have to be bad because they are, I don't know, black or whatever.
So, yeah, I mean, there is, you know, there's a big problem about getting to knowledge anyway in social understanding. But, yeah, okay, we can have a dialogue maybe through email about some of the things that you took. Yes. Thank you.
My name is Özge and I'm in the School of Sociology. I look at actually the question of national identity through a historical case study, not identity per se, but the creation of a imaginative nation of collective identity. And it's actually a case study which hasn't been done before. It looks at Kazakh nationalist movement within the Russian Empire at the beginning of the 20th century, so before the Soviet Union, and just when the Civil War was happening. And it's the first time I came across intersectionality and also the translocational positionality. And most of the nationalism theorists, a lot of them, or the main ones, they look at social transformations, traditionalism, democracy, etc. So I think there are points where I could really apply this, because I look at this specific group of intellectuals who were faced with a colonial administration, who themselves didn't feel part of Kazakh nomads, and most of the population were nomads, but they were secular educated and intellectuals. They knew Russian and Kazakh, but they were barred from political participation in the Russian state parliaments. So that they believe, and there's some theory by Oleg Kadori who says, talks about peripheral nationalism. So where nationalism arises when intellectuals are barred from, or where they say, okay, we have to be our own nation in order to receive our own powers. And I like the analytical levels, because there is a lot of discourse going on, and there's also a redefinition of Kazakhness among the intellectuals, where they try to reframe Kazakh nationhood and even take the concept of genealogy, so something that all Kazakhs were tied to, and say this is the basis of our nation. And in that respect, I think the translocational positionality is good because it looks at the way I guess at different points in time people identify or find different ways of identifying themselves. Yeah. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just add something about the notion of solidarity? Because in my work, I've come to the notion of solidarity starting from the feminist post-colonial critique of the notion of global sisterhood. So the question was, is still there the possibility of having a common project among women positioned differently and unequally? And solidarity seemed to be a possible alternative, but then you needed to decline it, and that's why I've come to the notion of reflexive solidarity. And now I was wondering how to elaborate further from that notion. And we were talking yesterday, Sam was asking what does it mean, solidarity exactly, and how you define it. And for instance, does it also mean that those who are in a privileged position could learn from those who are in a disadvantaged position? And this, for instance, came very clear in one of my interviews. Like migrant women, some of them were saying, actually, Italian-born women are not really learning anything from us, anything major. They are going to tell you that they have learned something from us, but in reality, this learning is about minor issues. So I was wondering, how do we research on the changes that should take place in the more privileged categories of people in the majority population, for instance. And in particular, I was wondering about a specific point you made about hybridity. And in one of your articles, you mentioned the fact that the acid test of hybridity lies in the changes of the majority population, right? So how do we research about this? Because I found this very insightful, but I found that was the part that I found most difficult in my research, to analyze the changes of the majority population. So that was it.
Thanks very much, Erica. Will you take one more? Okay. Yeah? Who else wants to share? You don't have to. You know, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, if you want lunch,
yeah, sure. But the idea was, because it's a postgraduate workshop, that, well, first of all, be looking as well what your exciting projects are, and secondly, that you get here the chance, not in a formal conference environment, to share a little bit about your thoughts. So don't be shy, share. Who wants to share next?
Okay, so I try.
Yes, okay.
So my name is Michal. I'm struggling now with PhD proposal for School of Sociology to be called whiteness of Poles. So I have to say that I should look closer at this intersectionality because I would like to put my work into empirical context. It would be like general elections, and there will be like a 100th anniversary of 1916 uprising. So probably it would be a place, like it would be about a socio-political discourse, like Polish and Irish in this time. Recently I spoke to local election candidates, Poles who started, and so I can see now that it's like not only about whiteness, like about just skin color, it's more like an ideology, plus gender and class is important as well. Like, for example, there were only one woman as a candidate. Most of them were male. Man. And it's like on the other side, it's all of them are with biblical background. So yes, and for me it's like really important now to look closer at what you said. So it's what I wanted to share. We have to think it over more and more, and I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. I was going to say that there's a lot of work that's been done on Poles in the UK, because you probably are aware of the work that Johnny and
because what I'm interested now, like that it's we finish at the end. Who is going to be like a Polish leader, or like activist, and we end with just a white male from middle class. You know what I mean? And it's like just started like Poles are probably more and more politically active now.
Yeah.
And there is like typical about even network. From I think that it's the pattern is taken from Irish politicians. So.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Great. Should I?
And just one more. Just one more, because so now I think about going from just theory to more like real empirical research, and to connect everything, like you said, that it's everything plays, and it's interactive. So this class, gender, whiteness.
That would be good. I mean, it would be something that hasn't really been done, as far as I know, with looking at Poles in the UK so much. The work of John Eade is good, but it doesn't really look at issues of gender, although it does look at issues of class. That would be great. In terms shifted? You know, how have they been transformed in the process of contact with other groups of people in terms of solidarity? And I think it is an under-researched area. The privileged are under-researched in general. There's so much focus on the disadvantaged, for perhaps understandable reasons, but in order to understand the disadvantaged, you also have to understand the privilege, because their disadvantage stems from the privilege. And I think we need a lot more work on, on this. But who are the privileged? You see, this is the thing. How do we construct privileged? Privilege is a term that's often used in terms of class privilege, isn't it? Of course, there's race privilege, but the race, if you think of, white working class women, it would be very difficult to think of them as privileged, even though they may be privileged in relation to black working class women. But the disadvantage of black working class women is not the result of white working class women, although some of the racism that black working class women might get comes from white working class women. So the whole idea of where is privilege, this is a completely under-researched area.
I was just wondering, something that struck me, that's so interesting, and I say that, but the research I've done in Mexico, they had loads of different groups of researchers and indigenous women working together. So it was this whole how to work together to develop a transversal feminism. And I spoke to you about that before, but Aida Hernandez has, in that context, and I don't know if she has published in English on that, but certainly in Spanish she has published on a kind of self-reflection, being Mexican but being from a more privileged background, not being indigenous, how she feels being privileged, but at the same time, when she does workshops with indigenous women and they only speak their native language, she feels that she has no access. There is a different ranking system than within that workshop constructed. So it's kind of flip side. She feels then like the outsider, not being privileged, but rather not having access. So it's maybe just a thought that struck me. Sorry for misusing my position. Yes, she can, but it just struck me. Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
I think it also relates back to the point that Eben was making earlier on, and saying she wants to look at labour market disadvantage, and how that operates for three different groups: Nigerian migrants into Ireland, Polish migrants into Ireland, and Spanish migrants into Ireland. And it does seem to me that from the levels that Floya was identifying, and she was saying, naming what you're studying in a way, that kind of narrative level is clearly one of the ways you're going to address that. You're planning on having narratives from different migrants, recent migrants into Ireland or whatever, and what their experience has been and what their trajectory has been and all of that. But you also want to look at the way in which the discrimination process works, So you're going to be looking maybe at an organisational level, or employer level, and maybe the role of the state in terms of having protective legislation, or all of those things. So those levels, the discursive level, the organisational level, the narrative level, they all seem to me to answer some of those kinds of questions that you're asking. And I just thought, as the discussion has gone on, I hope that you're finding more, that you can name what it is that you're doing in a culturally specific period of time, that the specificities of the Irish context that you're looking at.
Well, and one thing everyone should be considering too is, at the end of the day, in terms of your thesis, right? You're working, these are all tools that you can use to elicit narratives and other forms of expression that tell stories and counter stories, but what you're going to have to produce at the end is your story and your narrative of how you are experiencing this, right? And how you are choosing to put all of these stories together, and how you've chosen to shape and sculpt the problematique, right? And I think a
lot of what Floya is talking about is using intersectionality as a tool so you can articulate and sculpt the phenomenon, right, that you are focusing on, and then your narrative around that. And one short point with in response to some of the things that were mentioned earlier, we have to remember, both in terms of our conceptual and methodological tools, that we are inheriting. When I was talking about struggling with our traditions and our tools that shape the context in which we're working on, in terms of both theory and method, we have inherited a legacy of what started out as being part and parcel of the colonial project, the Enlightenment project, the project of the state, global capitalism, etc., etc. So we're constantly, I mean, in many ways, always in dialogue with that, because the theories about nationalism, theories about the state, and we're trying to work up from and against that, because we've been socialized into using this way of thinking and looking into the world. And now we're speaking back to that, as well as trying to find our way forward, both in terms of research and activism. And then, you know, going further, I mean, do we ever get away from methodological nationalism? Because we can be talking about all of these, you know, amazingly complex things in terms of how do we grasp experience and then represent it and reproduce it as a way of bringing these stories forward transformatively. So, and so then, you know, again, all of a sudden, we go from that to, well, I'm going to do interviews, right? Okay, and we're just going back to all, because people tell stories, and that's the way they tell stories, and that's the only way stories can be told. And one of the things we are going to be doing is looking and having some series on how do we bring together arts-based and social science-based methodologies in terms of tapping into people's expressive literacies, which mightn't necessarily be the narrative story. So, you know, and this is all part of how you discover, again, what tools help you tell the story that you're telling, knowing how very much we're so contextualizing, rooted in this particular way. It's about the state. It's, you know, we have it. It's just infused in our bodies and our ways of being in the world. That it's, you know, we have this nation-building state project that we're always sort of carrying with us in a way.
Thanks very much, Alice, for actually shifting a little bit the focus from just the theoretical part also into methodology. And I think that's what Floya said in her presentation yesterday and today. You know, how do we do intersectionality, or how do we use the approach? Now, narratives, of course, is one of the ways what Alice has just highlighted. There are different ways of connecting narratives. There are people, for example, who work with theatre. I work with theatre of the oppressed myself to try to get to a new narrative problematizing language. You know, what if the narratives you want to listen to is not in your own language, or what if you build hierarchies through the whole process of research by presumptions, etc. We have a few people who haven't spoken yet. I'm just looking at the watch, and I just wonder, will we...
There's coffee and lunch outside. Yeah, if we want to
do that. And then we take the next kind of set of ideas and responses, but at least you got your coffee. You haven't gotten the coffee yet, and that was on my little markers. I thought, oh, Floya, to get her to the little lecture, responding non-stop. The woman hasn't had her coffee yet, so we really need to get that started. Human rights, come on.
Last night Floya didn't get her dinner on.
Oh my God, she's never coming back to Dublin, people. Ask her why she's here. Okay, so will we all break? So about 10 minutes, if we just get outside, grab what we want, and bring it back.
And we can continue.
Yes, and if we get into trouble to bring food in here, we deal with that.
So very much is something she said something. Yes, but she's doing something else. Yeah, that's Okay, so yeah, we were still working on it. Yeah, that was great. Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. It's in the line. Okay. Thank you very much.
Roughly, let's say half an hour left until, very unfortunately, we have to let Floya go again. So we have 30 minutes in order to further develop our new discourses and getting the most out from Floya, from Floya's expertise. Floya. I will, yes, I will.
I know I will.
No, I will remind you. If you're breaking it once, so you have 15 minutes to. Perfect. So what I would like to suggest, because we were saying or we had the idea, the vision, Alice, who designed the workshop, we all together, what was the idea that the postgraduates can elaborate on their research and can use this as a forum. So, of our distinguished participants who hasn't spoken yet, we would like those to go first, and then Floya coming in the end, maybe taking all those students first. How many do we have who hasn't spoken yet? One? Just one? Two?
But only if you don't feel the need.
Only if you want to. I said that earlier on. I mean, you had lunch now, so we only give you lunch and your speak doesn't count. so we have at the moment two. So if you'd like to go first, if there's someone who wants to come in, then afterwards we let you go first, then we bring Floya back, and then we do a wrap-up session. Is that okay with everyone? Yeah? Does that sound good? Okay. Okay. We let you go first. You are so brave one. Raise your hand. Okay, so share with us your name and your project.
Okay, my name is Lisa Phelan. I'm a PhD student in School of Social Justice. And my research is focusing on political inequalities, and I'm taking it from the point of view of inequalities in voting. So unequal levels of voter turnout and low voter turnout among specific groups of people. So I'm very new to this intersectionality theory, framework, argument, and so when I was reading the articles, I don't know how much I could apply to my research, but I do feel there's something there in how I can maybe use it. When I look at the literature around voter turnout and that a lot of the dominant themes are about categorising people with respect to either ethnicity, their race, age, gender, levels of education, and flagging that people will either vote or not vote or behave in a certain way depending on which category they fall into, and that's used as a marker for what level they will participate in politics, be it by voting or by becoming members of political parties, etc. So I want to get away from looking at categories and labels and identity or however we talk about it, and look more at the structural inequalities that are resulting in people not being enabled and mobilised to participate to an equal level as everybody else. So I suppose I'd like to delve more into intersectionality and looking at some of these arguments and maybe how to apply that, and especially the organisational and structural focus, and see how to use that to kind of contextualise that a bit. So that's kind of where I am.
Sure.
What method are you using?
I haven't really decided that yet. At the moment, I'm kind of applying a human rights-based approach to the issue. So instead of looking at, you know, the dominant themes, we look at, say, you know, these groups of people will probably go, these won't, you know, and it like turning on its head and kind of looking at what initiatives are there and what efforts governments need to enable people and mobilize people. So that's urgent.
Thanks very much, Lisa. There was another. Yeah, do you want to share with us? Perfect. Yeah.
My name is Seiko, as I'm a visiting scholar in the School of Social Justice. Originally, I'm from Finland, and I'm currently doing a postdoctoral study on female journalists in Finland and Sweden, and how they see gender equality within their own profession. And my time period is for the female journalists. In Sweden, the time period is from 1960s to the present, so it's quite long. And my question is, how do you use intersectionality when you are doing this long period or researching long period of time, because those categories are changing during that time. They are intersecting in different ways in the 1970s than they are doing it now. And other thing is how should one think about, for example, age, when you see that age matters, but then your informant says that it doesn't matter. One example is from the current situation in Finland. The media field has huge incremental difficulties at the moment, and people have lost their jobs, and it's clear that mostly they are old people who have lost their jobs. And my informants, they know this, they are older women, but they say that it doesn't matter.
Is it print journalism or broadcast journalism?
Broadcast and print. And then last question is about the concept of class. Finland and Sweden, either they are not that class-based societies, but for example, in the 70s, the political orientation had a huge meaning. There was a huge divide between those people who were right-oriented and those who were left-oriented, and even though there were a lot of people who had this kind of communistic ideology, and those who were communists, they were not all the time working class people, but there were a lot of people who had a middle class background. And I'm thinking, I don't feel very comfortable of using the concept of class, but what could I use in this kind of situation? And thank you for your lectures. It has been really inspiring.
Thank you for sharing. That's great. Is there anyone else? There are people who triggered in me just open for a last round of sharing experiences. Is there anyone else who'd like to? Okay, fair enough. You go ahead. Yeah.
So I was a little bit reluctant to speak because I'm not sure if I'm going to use the concept of intersectionality in my research. And then secondly, I think my research is taking a turn which I did not anticipate when I started. So basically, I'm looking into cosmetic procedures performed on female genitalia for the purposes of beautification, so for non-medical purposes. And initially my idea was to compare that or contrast that with FGM, female genital mutilation, which we have criminalized and which we condemn. And yet we have all these cosmetic procedures, which is a boom in the industry now. And yet that's almost becoming normalized to interfere and intervene in healthy and basically normal female body for the purposes of looks. But now, as I'm going deeper into it, I'm thinking FGM might fall out of the picture, and I might be focusing more on the cosmetic procedures as such. I'm doing a phenomenological study, which basically means that I will be doing in-depth interviews with, I'm guessing 6 to 8 women who have undergone this procedure. And basically, I guess I'm trying to understand the incentives for these procedures and women's relatedness to the socio-cultural environment, which tells you that you should be looking in a very particular way to be considered attractive and basically be socially accepted as a woman. So yeah, that's where I'm now.
Are you dressing your thing as you noticed it?
I'm using a female genital cosmetic surgery as the umbrella term, which looks into labiaplasty, clitoroplasty, G-spot amplification. There is a whole range of procedures that could be done. And then when you have a look at FGM, on the other hand, these are comparable procedures, and the health, long-term health consequences are comparable as well. And that makes me wonder, well, you had a Somali woman coming with her baby and asking for a labiaplasty, would that be acceptable? Because, yeah, when third world countries do it, we call it mutilation, and when we do it, we use all these fancy terms, and we do it in sanitized conditions, and then we call it beautification. So, yeah, I'm thinking we have to critically examine what we do to ourselves first.
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking project indeed. Yes, thank you. Okay. Anyone else wants to come in before we go over to Floya for some insights and comments?
Maybe if I might be able to pick some more apart from all the ones I've picked already.
Okay. Briefly, yeah. Come in.
Just because around my research, I'm looking at racial stratification and the intersection of racial stratification and social acceptance, and how that influences the socioeconomic disparity among migrants. So again, there are two main structures. There's intersectionality. Yes, but rather than focusing on, that's where I started from anyway. So rather than focusing on intersectionality itself, it's racial stratification and how that intersects with different things, but I'm focusing on the fact that it's socially acceptable, so that each of those things is intersects with. The more socially acceptable they are, that might influence, how they are stratified, or the way their socioeconomic outcome, happens at the end of the day. So that's the thoughts that was at the back of my mind when I was starting, and so one of the things we're working on now is developing a methodology around that. So I'm just looking at the general idea of intersectionality is we focus on the different categories, but what you're saying now is that rather than the categories, we're looking at the positions, So again, that really fits with, the idea that it's a stratification. So yeah, just any advice you can give around that.
And one thing while I'm thinking about it is, it's interesting in terms of when you think about choosing your sample and who you're going to include, oftentimes it's led by categories, having age, having gender, having race. But what if you take it in terms of positionalities, people who are positioned differently, because within each of those you'll get different stories about different configurations of the institutional, the discursive, and different journeys or pathways or trajectories. So it can allow you to think a little bit differently about your sample and building depth and nuance, because intersectionality demands that you focus on the depth and the nuance, right? That's where the story is, and that's where a lot of the practical or perhaps policy or other types of translations and applications are, because the state is all about, you have a policy, you have a target group, categories, 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 different statuses, different X, different Y, right? So in a way, it's trying to transform those structures of the state and it's almost subverting the state through complexity and diversity, right? So again, a different way of thinking about your samples, so fewer entities that constitute your samples, but greater depth and getting a different type of picture through the different trajectories.
Thanks very much, Alice. That's really important. Before we get back to Floya, there is one more comment. We really want to get also one of the voices in who haven't spoken yet. So, please.
I was kind of feeling that there's
bit uneasy at one stage when Floya started to discuss serious theoretical concepts. Why? Because I finished my PhD, I think, long time ago. Now, it's 2011, not so long. But immediately after that, I wasn't able to stay in the academic environment, though before that I was in the academic environment for about 10 years, based mostly initially started in Trinity and then in UCD. So my PhD thesis started in a way and ended in a completely different way. And I was actually looking at group formation within a particular ethnic group. And I was involved in parallel over the last 7 years while I was working on my PhD as well in various projects that looked at social integration, social relation, and between the dynamics in the ethnic groups living in Ireland and the group formation and identity of a particular group. And my thesis was focusing on Romanians in Ireland because it was at that stage before Romania was accessing, was fully a member of EU. There was a lot of migration from Romania in Ireland here, and a lot of people came here through the asylum system, and they settled in the country, and they have children and their family, but hence they were the last to be organized, and form a group that would have a social, to speak for themselves like a group. And I was very interested in finding what's going on there. Why are they not united? Why are they not coming like a group to speak for themselves because they were rationalized? They were always picked on, oh yes, they are Romanians. There were all sorts of issues with Romanians and Romania and everything, that comes from that specific nationality. So I was studying that, and I found very interesting that I started from community formation was the idea of, because at that time in Ireland, everyone who would speak to you would put you in a box, and would say, okay, oh, you belong to Romanian community, you belong to Polish community, you belong to Chinese community, okay? And hence, a lot of Romanians didn't want it to be associated with the community idea, that concrete social relations that you presented in this sort of, the third level of abstraction. I found myself positioned in that area. And I used a lot of Brubaker's work in the group formation, ethnicities without groups. Okay, so I think this is the area which I can use the intersectionality, and it was very interesting because when I finished my thesis, I couldn't be able to stay in the academic environment, and I was pushed towards, in the community, and I did a lot of research and work for the community based on the grassroots of the, work and social work. And I did completely, I started to reshape myself again. And, but here somewhere it was, okay, I miss the academic research, I miss the academic research, I crave the academic research. And it was very hard for me to do a piece of research for kind of a prestigious organization like IOM, okay? Because they didn't like my literature review. They didn't value the literature review, okay? So they value what I speak to the people in the field, what I come with the results, what I come, what did they say. They didn't like the criticisms they didn't like, you know. So it was very, very hard for me, and I felt hurted, you know, kind of. I said, what am I going to do? Am I going to spend all my life doing this sort of contract research for various organizations and not? And eventually, thanks God, I managed to come back to do research from the academic environment and in a different. And now I'm in a position to publish because I'm affiliated, and I would I thank you very much to my former PhD supervisor, Alice Cannon, who invited me to this talk and to your talk, because I feel that I can publish now. Parts of my thesis, okay? And